welcome. My name is Oriana Ides. I'll introduce myself a little more in just a second, but really grateful to be here with you all in this conversation for the next 90 minutes. Welcome to Honoring Our Humanity, Healing-Centered Harm Reduction Practices. A lean into that, right? We're hoping that today allows us to get creative with the ways in which we support our community in healing, the ways in which we support ourselves in healing. And so welcome for that. I'm going to share a bit of housekeeping. And so please bear with us through the technical parts before we get into the conversation. Brief disclaimer, this event is supported by SAMHSA, and we are very grateful for all of the ways in which their financial assistance makes our work possible. But with that said, the ideas presented today are that of ours and our presenters and not necessarily endorsed by SAMHSA. This offering is prepared by NTAC under a cooperative agreement with SAMHSA. A word about cybersecurity. I'll say this every time. I've never experienced the need for this, but in any case, there is something that feels unsafe for us that we cannot mitigate in the session. We might need to shut down, and if that happens, we will communicate with you through the email you registered for. Okay. We are NTAC, the National Training Technical Assistance Center for children, youth, and family mental health, right? And we are a collaborative of these powerful organizations here. We come together to imagine offerings for the field. And so just want to uplift that this is a partnership. A bit about our vision as a project and the services that we provide. All children, youth, and families living with and impacted by mental health challenges will have access to the resources and opportunity they need to thrive in a comprehensive and equitable system of care. Right? We believe that deeply, and through creating conversations, uplifting community valued approaches, as well as evidence-based approaches through publications, webinars, conversations, communities of practice, and technical assistance and coaching. Anyone joining us for the very first time? Maybe drop that in the chat. And if so, welcome, welcome. If you're returning, welcome, welcome. A few commonly asked questions. So you will receive a follow-up email after today's session that will have the slide deck in it. And we are recording this event, so that will be available as well. And you will also be emailed a certificate of attendance following, and that is automatic. All right. So just briefly, this offering today was initially visioned by the three of us, myself, Oriana Ides, Shane McDonald, and Karina Joyner. We are so excited to have had the opportunity to come together and think about who we would like to bring to this community, what wisdom, what energy, what hope we would like to bring into a conversation around reimagining healing and uplifting harm reduction through a healing-centered lens. And so just want to shout folks out for all of the work that you put in. I'm based in Oakland, California. I'm a longtime educator. I'm a parent. I'm a parent of a formerly incarcerated young person, someone who struggles with use, and I see that as a lifelong journey our entire family is going to be forever engaged in. And so I just want to say that this is also really personal work to me as well. And many of us are here. I think there's about 86 of us. So the time is now to please introduce yourself, even if you've already done it. If you could find the chat and share who you are and where you're located, maybe the role that you play in caring for others. If you want to expand that beyond the paid work that you're engaged in, I invite you to do that as well. And maybe a word or two about what brings you to today's conversation. So any part of that introduction that feels accessible to you, I invite you to share in the chat, and you see folks are beginning to do it as well. Lovely. We got North Carolina in the house, Texas, Boston, Michigan. Lovely. Peer support specialists, facilitators, New York, California, Reno. It's really powerful to be able to connect in this way across space, right? Our experiences are unique and also universal. And I really value how we're able to come together in learning and sharing. I invite you to scroll the chat and see who you're in this space with. Right? There's a lot of work that we've all done to create today's offering, but much of what surfaces today will be largely your wisdom, your energy, your experience as well. Adrienne Marie Brown says there's a conversation that only we can have, and it really is our work, this constellation of people, to find that conversation, right? To lean in and not be passive listeners. And so please do scroll and see who you're here with. I'm going to share just very briefly, in the spirit of trauma-informed practices, a bit of a preview for our time together today. I do want to say that we'll spend probably about 5 more minutes in the welcoming and grounding. In just a moment, I will invite you to settle into your body with some guidance that you can follow if you so choose, as well as a land and a labor acknowledgement. After that, I will share a bit about healing-centered engagement. I hope to keep that very brief because our panel is so dynamic. But we will have an opportunity to break into small groups. So just letting you know that now. Some people deeply love this opportunity. Some people can feel maybe not in the right space to be in smaller groups. So just want to preview that and hope that you can lean into this discomfort just a bit, because there is so much opportunity within the small group discussion. And if you do not want to be in the small group, there will be an option to stay out, and that's fine and respected. And then we'll engage in a panel conversation. We hope that you listen with your heart, with an open mind, that you are thinking about questions you would like to pose our panel as well. And then there'll be an open discussion for all with a closing practice and looking ahead. All right. Any point, invite you to say if you have any technical, technical needs, you can reach out to Joanne at any point. I want to say that here on this slide. And yeah. um, opportunity to ground together. So many of us are in the early part of our afternoon, and some of us are just starting our day, but want to make some sacred space to slow down and be in this conversation around healing-centered engagement. For many of us, this is the work that we're already doing, and it'll be an opportunity to feel affirmed. For some of us, this will be absolutely new, and it'll be a bit of a paradigm shift. And the way you receive today's offering is deeply connected to your body's ability to feel regulated and settled. And so with that acknowledgement, I just want to invite you to find comfort in your seat. You can, as I said, follow along with me if that feels accessible or comfortable. The next 30 seconds, you can choose from a list here, or you can follow my words. Just notice the quality of your breath in this moment. Maybe invite a deeper breath. Maybe offer your posture, whatever it might need, so that your breath can flow a little more fluidly through your lungs and your throat. Can you deepen that breath all the way down to your feet, maybe? And allow a sweeping inhale and exhale out your mouth. Before you drop your shoulders, might you lift them to your ears and allow them to fall. You pay notice to the tension that you're holding in your face. Maybe close your eyes or lower your gaze. Soften the tissue around your eyes. Unclench your jaw. You really feel your breath flowing out through your nostrils on your exhale. You do a scan from the bottom of your feet to the top of your head, releasing any tension you're holding in your body, finding softness and comfort. Can you connect to the earth beneath your feet? Staying with your breath, staying in your body, can you extend down into the earth? Make any effort you can to stay with your breath. I'm going to read a land acknowledgement and invite you to just listen to my words. This land acknowledgement was written by and with young people at Rise Center here in Richmond, California. We gather here today on unceded Ohlone, Miwok, Mukwemat land, Confederated Villages of the Lishan lands. For so many of our communities, we have been disconnected, displaced, and dispossessed from our lands through histories and legacies of conquest, removal, extermination, and migration, forced and fueled by enslavement, genocide, trafficking, imperialism. For so many of our communities, disease and illness have served as colonizing pathogens to quell and kill us, by design and by default. And today, as we endure, resist, and survive state violence here on Turtle Island, we denounce the ongoing, escalated state violence and terror going on today against our communities, against Palestinian kin living under occupation. We remember that all violence is state violence and serve in solidarity to end violence with all those decrying and fighting for violence, to building a nation across the diasporas. Nation building, sorry, across diasporas. And many of us also are on this land as descendants of slave-owning and settler families and classes benefiting from the fallacy and violence of white supremacy and manifest destiny. We acknowledge the indigenous lands we are on, that the land is our kin, and that we are mutual stewards of our survival and liberation. Continuing to stay with your breath, continuing to find connection with the land. We are here today by the labor, love, risk-taking, and tenacity of young people who have grown up through our organizations and schools, young people who are now our ancestors. May we honor them in this moment. Young people who understood the assignment of justice and equity, building spaces as legacy for those coming up after them. We also gather here today through the unpaid, unhonored, and exploited labor of Black, Brown, and minoritized communities, of unrecognized female and femme labor, love, and unjust sacrifice. We acknowledge the systems of economic exploitation still going on today, everywhere, all the time. And we honor the fortitude, the resilience, the resistance, the expression, the creativity, the love, and the rage of our ancestors and our living kin. With our next deep collective breath, can we feel deeply into the love, the work, the care, the aspiration, and desire of Indigenous people, of young people, of our direct ancestors, and of those struggling to find safety and comfort and dignity and belonging in this moment. As you come back to this space, as you feel connection to your body, maybe open your eyes or raise your gaze and look around the room that you're in to find any source of light or life that brings you comfort and ease. And I invite you to find the chat and share how it's feeling for you right now to settle in this way. What is surfacing for you? What feelings, what memories, what needs? What practices do you lean into to find grounding in times of overwhelm and activation? Maybe you want to keep this information for yourself. You can, it'd be lovely to hear in the chat. Right, so some moments of relaxation, tone of safety. Thank you. Needed to reconnect with my body. Right? Sometimes we're moving so fast, we don't even know that this is what we need. Many of us guide other folks through settling, right, practices and don't quite have the time to engage in them ourselves. Thank you. Right. Thank you. For me, it's so important that we start this way, especially when we're uplifting healing-centered practices, healing justice, healing-centered engagement. What is most powerful to me about healing-centered engagement is that center to it is an acknowledgement of the historical impact, right, and the socio-political climate of this moment, and that our healing has to acknowledge the terror, right, and the violence of this country's history and many of its present day practices, structures, and policies, right? And so with our land acknowledgement, I hope it did not feel performative. I hope that it allowed us to really lean into um, much of the experience, the history, the dream Indigenous folks have endured, that Black people have endured in this country, that young people are enduring. And healing-centered engagement to me is so much connecting with that from any of our multiple identities. Right. So we want to spend some time very briefly thinking about what healing-centered engagement is. And as we do that, I'd like to uplift the words of Dr. Sean Jenwright. And he shares that we need a fundamental shift in our values, a pivot in how we think, connect, act, and work. A pivot acknowledges collective harm and individual injury, but also leans into future and opens entirely new possibilities, right? Complete transformation can feel quite overwhelming. And what Dr. Sean Jenwright says is that just a little step in a different direction, after a few steps, you're going somewhere completely different, right? And so this idea of pivoting towards something different. Also want to uplift this idea of normal, or of returning to something that existed, that oftentimes what existed before the crisis or before the violence did not work as well. And that is why we are here in this moment. And so it's really about imagining something completely different. At any point, I'd love to hear in the chat what surfaces for you as you read these words, as you think about this invitation to pivot. And also in framing today, we want to really acknowledge the ecological system, right? Our medical model is very individualistic. It is very in this moment and doesn't acknowledge history, legacy, and structure. And so we want to, as we're entering into this conversation, really uplift the idea that our healing is relational, just as our harm is relational as well. Right. And so the ecological system moves beyond what the medical model, is just focusing on the problem, and really thinks about, in addition to the individual, how are our relationships, our community environment, the systems and structures supporting our healing and supporting or causing our harm. And kind of also laying the groundwork for today's conversation, we want to uplift this way of thinking about healing-centered harm reduction. And I want to invite someone in a participant to unmute and read this quote, if possible. Anyone open to doing that for us? Britt, please. I see your hands up. I welcome you.
Sorry, I was having a hard time finding your screen. I was looking
Oh.
at everyone else. So the entire quote there?
If you're down for it.
Okay.
Thank you.
Healing-centered harm reduction is a set of practical strategies and a movement to address the harms perpetuated by an unjust society through education, increased accountability, community mobilization, and redistribution of resources. Harm reduction begins with recognizing toxic ideologies surrounding sex, sexuality, drugs, relationships, gender, and race. Racial, economic, disability, and gender justice cannot be divorced from efforts to reduce harm. Healing justice is a cornerstone of harm reduction. As part of this practice, we uplift survival, honor cultural legacies, and foster information. Our work is ultimately focused on healing from those harmful ideologies and addressing the ways in which they play out across interpersonal interactions and institutions.
Beautiful, beautifully read. Thank you. Thank you so much. So as you are all listening to Britt read, and as you were maybe reading it yourself, I invite you to share in the chat a string of words, maybe 3 to 5 words consecutive, that really stand out to you in this framing. If you could drop them into the chat for a bit of a choral read, that would be so appreciated. What words are standing out to you? Oh, thanks, Crystal, for getting us started. Redistribution of resources, healing centered, survival, honoring cultural legacies, education. Begins with recognizing, yes, survival, justice. Healing has no judgment. Uplift survival, accountability. Thank you. And as you are drawn to those words, maybe invite yourself to wonder why. Why are these words resonating with you right now in this moment? What feelings do they incite in you? I invite you to kind of lean into it in the chat. Thank you. I'm going to continue to look at the chat as I set us up for our small group discussion. And so hopefully we can bring our experience with the settling in and the land acknowledgement, this idea of pivoting towards healing, of thinking about a healing beyond the individual to encompass more than, right? A look back and a look into the future, into our group discussion. So this is really powerful principles of healing centered harm reduction that are going to be dropped in the chat in just a second. I'm going to invite you to join small groups of 4 if you feel open to it. And maybe if you feel mixed, lean into the openness a little. If it's absolutely not an option for you today, you are not in the right space for it, that is respected and you can stay back. But the idea is that we'll join into 4 groups of 4. We'll have about 8 minutes and we'll share this. We'll look at the principles and be in conversation. So these questions will also get dropped into the chat. These are a lot of questions. They're too many. So we're not going to get to all of them, know that. But any one of them that you want to be in conversation with or just also go off script and talk about what's surfacing for you, that is all right as well. Any questions before we join small groups? Okay, so Joanna is going to break us into groups of 4. We have the opportunity to join. If you stay back, like I said, that is okay. So we might need to do some like moving around once folks get into their groups to honor that. And we'll have 8 minutes in our small group. Wonderful. All right, if you're not in a small group and you need help getting into your group, you can unmute and ask for help, or you can type your need into the chat and we can help you get into the small group. Or You can think about these questions on your own. Um, if you're not joining a small group, the link to the document um, is in the chat. I hope you still take a look at it. Thank you all for your flexibility. I think maybe I forgot to send the questions, but hopefully you had a time to work with that really powerful document and think about where it feels maybe present in your current work, or where you desire to um, cultivate some of the energy, principles, and practices of that document. And we will have time to discuss that. And so I want to introduce us to our incredible panel. If you feel like there was something that was shared in your small group discussion and you want to bring it to the larger group here, I invite you to share it in the chat. And our panelists will take a look at it. We will as well, and maybe incorporate it into some of our conversation. And so our incredible panelists. We are joined today by three incredible visionaries, folks working on the front lines in multiple areas of healing justice, and harm reduction work. And so I'm really excited. I'm not going to say too much about them because I love to hear in their own words who they are and how they've arrived to the work that they're doing now. And so I'm going to stop sharing, introduce you to Rochelle Faithful, Ismail Ali, and Maurice Bird. And in that order, they will offer a few minute introduction to who they are and a bit of their journey, what has arrived them to this place.
Okay, can get started just by way of the order of the PowerPoint. Good afternoon from Washington, D.C., Piscataway Ancestral Lands, Chocolate City to some. Really grateful to be here. And to share a little bit about myself, I describe my work either as a healing justice practitioner for audiences that are engaged with that framework. I also describe myself as a multidisciplinary healing artist and strategist. And the short version of how I find myself here is that I've been in movement for about over 20 years. And I started as an activist in high school, as a baby queer, and also a person who was radicalized by the um, uh, kind of the war, so-called war on terror. Who was doing anti-war work, and then found myself later learning about kind of more traditional forms of organizing as I went to school. Um, I'll share a story probably later about how like I really moved from those traditional forms of organizing to more community-based, um, like community building organizing, and how that helped me into both healing justice and also understanding harm reduction differently. Um, but you'll see that community organizing is part of my lifeblood. I'm also a movement lawyer. I don't practice full time anymore, but I'm still licensed to practice, and it's really important to me to be in solidarity with other radical lawyers. I'm initiated as a folk healer, traditional healer, so that is also another way I'm connected to healing justice as well as land justice and food justice. And I spend a lot of my time just behind the scenes in a lot of movement groups as a strategist and facilitator. And when I have time, like many of us, I'm a creative person. I have a background as a performance artist and a producer. I've dabbled in some other things. And I'm also currently connected to the West Coast by way of Star King School of Ministry. So I'm also grateful to be in a Radical Seminary program.
Amazing. I think I was next. Is that right?
Mhm.
Okay, awesome. Thank you, Rochelle. I know we've only had a couple of conversations in prep for this and listening. I'm just like, there's so many weavings and overlap, and I'm excited to share this panel space with you. And same with you, dear friend Maurice. It's been weaving in and out of so many conversations for the years, and really appreciate you, Oriana, for holding the space and for bringing us in, and for all the team involved. There's like 8 people on these emails, you guys. There's a whole team that's making this possible. So just really appreciate all of you and all of the work. My name is Ismail Lodido Ali. I also go by Izzy, depending on the situation. I'm calling in from Oakland, California at the moment, where I can't tell if it's summer, spring, or fall. It changes by the minute. I grew up in Fresno, California. For those that aren't familiar, it's about equidistant between Los Angeles and San Francisco, like right in the center of California. Very interesting demographic environment. Parents were both immigrants. My dad was born in Delhi and raised in Karachi, and my mother was born in Cali, Colombia, and they both came to Fresno State in 1986 and met at a Halloween party. So I was born and raised in like West Coast California life, but like with a lot of interesting kind of cultural threads, which like I think many mixed people, first generation people kind of reject, like both rejected and sought out simultaneously throughout the course of my life. I really appreciate, Rochelle, what you were saying, being radicalized by the war on terror. I was 11 when 9/11 happened. And the term that I've used for a long time was I was politically socialized without my consent. Like I had a political kind of structure imposed upon me. And when I was about 14 or so, once I started needing to react to like both the implicit and explicit discrimination that my family and community was experiencing as like a young Muslim in the relatively conservative Central Valley of California, started to like get aware and have to like really learn what I represented, whether I was aware of it or not. Much more to say about that, but kind of transitioning into the kind of purpose of this conversation, I, like a lot of people in a lot of places, was introduced and exposed to drugs in the drug underground as a pretty young teenager. It's really hard to be in environments like the one I was in, and I'm sure a lot of folks in the crowd as well, the audience as well, without having some sort of exposure. And I constantly feel grateful that while I, like, you know, many other young people at the time, got into all kinds of situations, some of which were more or less dangerous or risky, that I was rapidly introduced and part of and engaged with what I learned later would be a community of harm reduction. I didn't know what that term was when I was 15. Had done my own research on the internet, but didn't really have exposure to a lot of the concepts until really many years later. So being in the kind of shift personally of experiencing drugs, psychedelic experiences, all kinds of these different underground environments as a teenager, transitioning from a lot of angst to a lot of curiosity, and then a willingness to engage more with the system, which I think is what we'll talk about a little bit more today. Feel very grateful to have stumbled upon first harm reduction, and then, you know, the theme of today, which is like these kind of larger approaches, or these approaches to systemic structural questions and issues that affect us in the very acute individual level, but that kind of start much further out from our own individual experience. So just really appreciate that. And today I work as the Director of Policy and Advocacy at the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies at MAPS. I'm an attorney by training, and get to think a lot about, you know, what a lot of folks I think are here are engaged with, which is language I use as the design of a post-prohibition world. We all look back at the war on drugs and we're like, that definitely isn't working for all of these reasons. But I'm really curious about what we look forward to. And there's a lot of opinions, and I think, I don't know where we go, but I think wherever we go, we'll end up better if we go together. So I'll pause there for now, and just really grateful to be here in this conversation, and pass it to Maurice. Thanks, everyone.
Oh, wow. Thank you. Wow. Hearing everybody check in. I'm Maurice Bird, he, him pronouns, here in Oakland on Ohlone land. What's important is, maybe, let's see, I'm the director of training in business operations at the Harm Reduction Therapy Center. But more importantly, I am the grandson of Maybella Powell and Earl Powell and Arthur Bird and Dorothy Bird, and the son of Vicky Bird and Howard Bird. I'm a descendant of folks that were enslaved in this land and folks that are also native to this land as well. And I locate myself mostly as a person, as a family person. So I think of myself as a brother and a sister and a cousin and an uncle, very proud uncle. And all those parts of myself, and just like Ishmael, who's a person that has invited me into the community. I've been trained as a psychedelic therapist and practice as a psychedelic therapist too, with different medicines. And what's important, let's see, I'm a person that uses drugs, and I love people who use drugs as well too, and that's has sustained me in my work that I've done for the last 20 years, practicing harm reduction. And as Ishmael said, I as well too, I didn't have a word for it early on in my life as well too. And so I've been a person that has been exposed to the war on drugs, and my family has been as well too. I was born and raised in San Francisco, and I found my way to the Tenderloin, like a lot of young Black men do from the neighborhoods that I'm from, and got exposure that way, and really sort of found a path, if you will, to figuring out how we interpret, use, think about drugs and other things. And I think that's how I found my way here. I was very lucky. Early on in my career, I found a book called Over the Influence, written by Pat Denning and Jeannie Little, and lucky in that they became my teachers. So I come from that tradition as well too, of practicing harm reduction therapy from the grassroots nature of it, and we'll get more into that later. What else is important? You know, again, found my way here through the streets, really. And everything else has been all my other paths have been through harm reduction and harm reduction therapy. And I'll leave it there.
Thank you. Thank you all for sharing just a bit more than like the titles you hold, but a fuller kind of version representation of yourself. And I think it's so important as this work that we're thinking about how we bring these parts of our experience and our identity into our work, into our advocacy, into our creation. So thank you. And I want to ask you all if you could share how you might describe healing-centered harm reduction and why it has been or can be a transformative way of addressing healing in the human journey.
I'll get us started. I know there's lots of things to say here, but Ismail, I want to say hello too, because we have a connection through Reframe Health, right, and Justice, which is I'm grateful that definition was shared. And I will drop in the chat an interview with us. We're both in there. That share a little bit more about some thoughts, at least we had a few years ago. So I was rereading that and saying, like, does that feel like still resonate right now? And I think it does for me. And I think I'll start by saying, you know, personally, like everyone on this panel mentioned, right? Like I was introduced to harm reduction before I knew the term for it. I just knew that there are people in my life, um, mainly my family, like every member of my immediate family and many members of my extended family have different relationships with drug use and overuse and in some cases addiction. And I love these folks and I need them to be with us. I need them to be um, as well as possible, right? And you could just know firsthand, right, how brutal um, not only the systems can be in the institutions, which I expect to a certain degree, but also like people in our communities, right, who uh, can misunderstand drug use or sex work or many other ways in which people exist in the world as being dangerous and dangerous to them. Um, so there are a lot of ways in which I learned and continue to learn harm reduction just by way of being a family member and a caregiver. But my professional way of understanding harm reduction is through the framework of healing justice. Um, so I'll offer just a brief definition of healing justice, but then want to uh, share some connections I was making a few years ago that still make sense, I think, even through the onset of the pandemic when we had these interviews. But healing justice, if you're not familiar with that framework, it's a way of existing like harm reduction that's always existed. But this particular way it was articulated came by way of the Southeast, a group of Black, Brown, working class, white um, artists, healers, many types of folks who really were noticing the ways in which people were not surviving in movement and wanting to understand the deeper systemic reasons for it. So right now, the definition of healing justice that I use is through the Kindred, so they're the Healing Justice Collective. I was grateful to find them early in their 20-year journey, and they still exist and have shared more about their work and journey through Healing Justice Lineages, which is an excellent book if you want to learn more about healing justice. But they define healing justice as a community-led response to interrupt, transform, and intervene on individual and collective trauma to sustain emotional, physical, mental, spiritual, psychic, and environmental well-being. And the connection I've drawn to healing justice is I mentioned before that I was a traditionally trained organizer. But my heart really just ached because I felt so distant from the work. I felt so distant from the people. We're using lots of military language and really just felt out of body when I was doing that work. I was introduced to Southerners on New Ground, which was really a political home for me. This is an organizing outfit that still exists too, that centers on queer folks in the South. But what they did was really introduced me to when I say the first place I experienced coming together because of love, right? We didn't come together for a campaign, but we had love of our queerness, love of our blackness, our brownness, our brokenness, our bodies, our survival, and love as a sense of identity and place. And they reintroduced me to have a relationship with land, work, and spirit as a part of the work, which is something that I was so estranged from. So as I learned more about healing justice through song, through Kindred, the connection I was making to harm reduction is that it really helped me bring harm reduction to its roots. So I actually believe that harm reduction is not just a theory or practice, that it comes from a clinical place. It's really a tradition. And I think about all our many ancestors that have survived attempted genocides and terrorism and dehumanization. So in this way, it's not a form of healthcare, but it's really just being more truthful about our radical survival strategies and well-being, uh, especially for those of us who are political cultural targets, right? So for me, especially thinking about as a Black Southerner with, that traces many traditions also to people who were enslaved. I even think about ancestors who were kidnapped, right, put on slave ships, and then liberated themselves by jumping into the ocean as a form of harm reduction.
Mhm.
Um, so I just want to invite us to continue to think about the ways that harm reduction has been made and co-opted in a lot of ways by our mainstream healthcare system, and it's been made a lot more narrower, smaller, exclusive, and professionalized. But to me, the connection is we are part of traditions that already know how to reduce harm by necessity, and we continue to do so regardless of whether we're in an institutional setting or outside.
Maurice, you want to go next? You want me to? I feel like we just end the panel right there because I feel like Rochelle, that was fantastic. And also thank you so much for putting that interview in. I hadn't like forgotten about it, but it'd been a minute and I don't think I made the connection. So I'm really grateful that you named that. And if people get a chance to take a look at it later, it does, I think, still hold up a few years later, which is good because I guess just jumping off of your point, the words used to describe the concept of healing justice, or even like the thread of this conversation, healing centered harm reduction, the concepts, like the semantic concepts, are maybe newer, so we can like have the container to like talk about it in the technical sense and through public health lens and so on. But to your point, the underlying practices are not. And in fact, they're adaptations and extensions and evolutions of practices that have been built in. So I love that. I don't have too much to add to the definition, but I want to tease out a couple of concepts that you mentioned that I really appreciated. One is about this conception of danger and risk and safety. And actually, since you brought it up, and it's really built into my own understanding of this, not to get too off the rails, but a really good example of this is thinking about terror and terrorism, defined often as the unlawful use of violence, the non-state use of violence for political means. And had a lot of issues with that definition for a long time. One of the main ones being who gets to have the right to violence, and what does how does society kind of support the wielding of violence or power through one entity for another, often the government, but not always. And just pulling that metaphor out to talk about drugs, I mean, so much of the more modern conception of harm reduction is in reaction to a certain perception of what safety is or ought to be, what is safe for a person. And when you look at in the very, very micro setting, and I'm sure Maurice and probably you and others can talk more about this, there's like the very acute sense of, okay, there's a thing we're putting in our bodies. How do we keep people who are doing that safe, given the various risks that there are, adulteration, overdose, dependency, so on and so on and so on, which is a real thing. And like, that's an acute setting in which like all of the systemic stuff that's up for people kind of is brought to bear. Like, are they staying, can we keep them alive? A very acute direct services sort of sense. But as you kind of zoom out, like we, along the theme of this conversation, thinking about what is healing centered harm reduction, what is healing justice, to me, it starts to bring up the question of and the challenge of understanding like what exactly do we conceive of safety and who has the right to safety and what kind of safety. Because yeah, if you're defining safety as merely staying alive, then yeah, that kind of more narrow public health definition of harm reduction, I think, makes a lot of sense. It's like, is this person alive? But as we zoom out, I really like where you ended, Rochelle, around like the radical survival strategies and how harm reduction is also an adaptation, not just for survival in like, am I alive sense, but survival in a cultural demographic sense over time. And what that brings up for me is our species has co-evolved with non-ordinary states of consciousness That's one way to put it. We have used ritual, we have used ceremony, we have used plants, we have used magic. We used a lot of techniques over a long time on every continent. White people have done it too. Europeans did it too. Everyone has done it. To, you know, there's a lot of cosmologies and frameworks you can apply to that idea, but like we've all looked outside of our physical selves through history for a lot of reasons. And I would say, and I don't think this is a super original idea, but I would say that part of the reason we've done that is also a form of strategy, survival, and continuation. Like, what does it all mean? That is a question that we all ask at some point or another. And I imagine people have been asking that for a long time. So the way I like kind of connect these themes is that if we have had practices over time to help us make meaning, understand, and I like to think of psychedelics and other substances as tools for meaning making, and how they apply meaning in different ways affects like how risky they are, how dangerous they are, how tolerant we can get to them, how excited we are about them, and so on. That's a whole rabbit hole. But if we have had these relationships with substances of all kinds, admittedly, they're definitely more powerful now than they've ever been. That's true, just in a lot of ways. But if that's true, then what does that imply for the larger systems that we're having to live within, whether it's healthcare or housing or jobs or capitalism or life or so on? And where I've landed is, sounds like others, that I've kind of started wondered over the years, like, is it possible to apply these systems of harm reduction? Can we keep it alive for its change, for its continued existence and change? How to apply that concept that's so often applied in that kind of direct services interpersonal sense to these larger systems that define so much of our existence. So like I had the idea, like I had like a light bulb moment like 10 years ago. I was like, wait a minute. And you kind of already said this, Rochelle, at the beginning of your intro. It's like, you can be a healer, not just of people, but also of systems. Systems can also have their own pathologies and cultural baggage and so on. And I was like, oh, of course the concepts infuse in the systems, and suddenly we're dealing with a system that like works according to some metrics maybe, but like really doesn't according to others. And like what frame you apply matters. War on drugs is a great example. If you look at it through the lens of a desire to oppress Black, brown, and marginalized people, it's a total success. If you look at it through the lens of reducing drug use, it's a complete failure. So it's like, who's deciding what the frame is for how that system is applied? So just maybe to close this initial response piece and kind of go back to your actual original question, Ariana. When I think of healing-centered harm reduction or healing justice, it really just looks at what are the ways in which, what are the ways that we can apply healing modalities and healing arts? Healing being, in my definition, kind of approaching wholeness, or maybe it might be decompartmentalizing, but to me, I really think of it as approaching wholeness after a lifetime, maybe many lifetimes, many centuries of rupture. So it's like, what does, because healing means different things for different people. It's like, can we approach cohesion? Can we approach wholeness? Can we disrupt for the sake of alignment, not just disrupt for the sake of disruption? And that to me is like, that's where the edge is. It's like, how do you know? How do we know? That was a little bit rambly, but I hope it got to some of the points. And maybe I'll pass it to Maurice to bring it in too. Thanks, everybody.
I don't know why I decided to go after you two. I mean, what else is there to say? I'm just sitting here with my mind blown, and I think about harm reduction a lot. Maybe I'll just start by saying I think practicing harm reduction is a form of activism, right? Being harm reduction, living in a harm reduction way. I think whenever you're centering healing, we have to think about the one of the slides you showed earlier, Ariana, where we have to look at the different levels. Like, you know, where is it in legacy trauma, in legacy? Where is it in our community? You know, on an individual basis, we have to look at that. We have to pay attention to that. And I'm worried a little bit because how harm reduction is one of the questions that may come up, but how harm reduction is being framed right now, and who's taking the narrative of it right now. But if we look at the levels, right, we have to think about it from like, you know, like Izzy said some of this, like how do we heal people on like on a public health level, right? How do we look at what housing is and food safety? Like, how do we pay attention to those things as well too? How do we look at it from a human rights perspective? Because I'm convinced that the war on drugs is working exactly as designed. You know, there's no, if the design is to have free labor or close to free labor, then it's working exactly as designed. People sometimes will say it's broken, and I'm like, what's broken? It's not broken. It's working exactly as it's supposed to be. And then we also have to, you know, we're thinking that's our human rights level. We have to also be thinking about what it looks like for like treatment too. I'm a therapist, so I often go there, right? And I think about what does that mean to offer people humane treatment, and I want us to get out of that idea that treatment means one thing. It doesn't mean like putting someone into a house and telling them to stay away from drugs or taking care of their mental health. I want us to really like center what healing means, and often that means community. Often that means getting out of traditional ways of thinking. I want us to be thinking about that as well too. Because ultimately, what I think harm reduction really is centered around is keeping people healthy as possible, safe as possible, and alive. That's what we're. If we can get there, then we can move into what does thriving look like, right? I think we also need to think about some of the things that Rochelle and Ishmael talked about, like how do we absorb harm and how do we acknowledge whenever we are perpetrators of harm as well too, and do we have systems to repair ruptures that come up, um, and centering ourselves as well too, in the sense that we often will assume others are perpetrating harm without thinking about ourselves sometimes, and we all do. And that we're not above it all just because the three of us sit here and theorize with you all about what harm reduction, what harm reduction is. We're not above it all. We're part of it. So I like to always, you know, put myself in the center of it, beyond my titles and all the rest of that, to remind people what. That's why I tell people I'm a person that uses drugs, and I love people who use drugs as well too. And I think whenever we put ourselves in the center of it too, then we are actually practicing it, right? Because for me, and this is not for everyone, and I'll just share this, not for everyone, that like I said, I don't just like practice harm reduction and professionalize harm reduction. I also live like in a harm reduction life as well too. Um, I'll leave it. I'll leave it there because I know we have other questions.
Thank you. It's really hard to keep these questions like in a box because, and I love this, that it's so comprehensive and dynamic. And so you are all beginning to answer the next question. Oftentimes we are most familiar with harm reduction through work with substance use. And I hear you speaking to it in regards to so many different things, but I'm wondering maybe, Maurice, if you could share a bit more, like beyond substance use, towards other relationships and behavior. How might we begin to apply harm reduction
Mm. I
methods and practices? Yeah.
I appreciate that entry because I think it depends on how you come to harm reduction, right? Like most people actually, this is just my view of it is part of my job is like go around the country and talk with people about harm reduction, and most people actually view it more through a public health lens, I think.
Mhm.
That's what I think. Often people think about it as terms of like needle exchange and naloxone, you know, and like that sort of more public healthy thing.
Mhm.
And Rochelle said this, now I just want to put an exclamation on this point, is that harm reduction was not created by public health systems. It wasn't created by lawyers or doctors or therapists like me. It was created by my people, you know, your people, people who use drugs, people who love people who use drugs, sex workers, people who love sex, right? That's how it was actually created. And I think it's most often seen through a public health lens. But I think we need to actually view it through those a lot of different lenses. Public health is one of those things that's super important. Like we understand that whenever you make drugs illegal, Ishmael said so much that they become more dangerous, right? And we have examples in the world where people have decriminalized or legalized drugs and they become safer. I always point to alcohol prohibition. Like, you know, during alcohol prohibition, there was more deaths and the biggest crime wave we've had in this country, period. Whenever it became legal, all that stuff kind of went away, right? So we need to be looking at it through that lens. Like, what does it look at through public health? We need to be looking at it through housing. You know, like, you know, why don't we offer people housing before we ask them to do a whole bunch of things? There's some examples of in this country even where people were saying, "Oh, well, let's just give people housing and that solves the problem." I share this story really briefly. I was at a gathering of treatment providers, and one of the treatment providers, I they asked a question, and I said, "Well, you give people what they need. If people are hungry, you give them food. If people are experiencing homelessness, you give them housing." And one person that was there said, "Well, yeah, people who are homeless don't want housing." And I said, what are you talking about?" And I was like, "Well, who told you that? Like, what's going on here? What's going on here?" She was obviously a person that had not been around a lot of people who were experiencing homelessness. And she said, "Well, we try to get people housing and they don't want it." And I'm like, that's a notion that we have. We need to like conceptualize this. That's a prominent notion, I think, in this country, right? And then we need to also be thinking about it through the lens of human rights. You know, we have to pay attention to that. I think that's how you center healing, is that you think about legacy, is that you think about who's been harmed the most, or harmed most often by like things like the war on drugs, right? And then we also have to be, again, like centering what treatment looks like, you know, how we treat people. I think that's a lens often. That's one of the lenses that it depends on what your framework is, right? Where people are entering or thinking about it, which means that we need to be thinking about like, how do we treat people who use drugs? How do we treat people that are experiencing homelessness? How do we actually talk about that too? I'm a big proponent of language, you know, like, why are we still calling people addicts? Why are we still calling people crackheads? Why are we still using that language, right? Because we know it's disrespectful, and we know the images and thoughts that come to our minds when we use that kind of language. Um, and if we're centering healing, we can just start there. So I really think how we, if you do nothing else, right? If you don't get up off of your couch and, you know, march down Main Street with a, you know, with a band of people,
Mhm.
at least you can start thinking about it with yourself. We can start thinking about like how we think about people and talk about them affects how we treat them.
Mhm.
Period. There's been we have two lawyers in the room, so there's been a push for criminalizing homelessness and poverty and people who use drugs. Um, where do we and that's been framed almost as harm reduction, by the way. Who's taken the narrative, which is like completely blows my mind. And then at the same time, harm reduction has been blamed for overdose and deaths and the rest of those things. And I mean, I'll leave it with this question: is if there wasn't harm reduction, how many more deaths would we have? You know, San Francisco, in particular, um, experienced 806 overdose deaths last year. It's a lot. My question is, and I'm wondering if somebody can ever do the research on this, because I'm not a researcher and I don't have the proper amount of time to explore this. But how many more deaths would there be without harm reduction practices that we've had?
Mhm. Yeah. There's a question in the chat which is connected to a question that we had next on deck around safety. And so what are some of the safety aspects that should be considered when we're thinking about harm reduction or maybe risk reduction? And in the chat, is there a scenario where harm reduction isn't helpful?
You want to go, Rochelle, or should I jump in?
Anyone can answer that question.
Okay. All very good questions. And maybe I'll attempt to start sharing a bit, jumping off of one of the threads that you brought up, Maurice, just right now around like, how do we treat people? And you see this in some of the more cynical media about it, but I actually think that there is like an underlying important question there, which kind of goes to what Regina you're asking and also other people, which is, well, how do you help people? How do you treat people is like one layer of it. But I think that underlying that, there's actually a question of the worldview of how you approach the question of sovereignty, and not just safety on an individual level, but also on a social level. So I like a lot the shift, and maybe we may not have time today. This should be its own whole conversation, but I like the shift a lot of the language from harm reduction to risk reduction, because it does give a little, it actually is, in my opinion, more precise and allows us to actually look at the specific things we're looking at, which are the risks, which there are to a lot of behaviors, including drug use. So I start there because I think that it is easy for harm reduction to be reductively kind of seen as this this extreme belief in personal liberty that's so strong that it's like harm reduction means that someone can take themselves to the edge of death and beyond, and that we have to just let them do that. I think that's very cynical. I think that there's a lot of cynicism in that approach, and I think it's worth looking at the underlying question there, which is, who does get to decide what safety looks like? And what is society's job in putting the guardrails up on that ledge, or paying attention to when people are about to fall off and then pulling them back? And if we agree that reversing an overdose falls within the realm of that, then and that's, one end of the spectrum, extreme version of this response. What are all of the places up to that point? Where are all of the other interventions that support people not getting to the edge of that point? And maybe, Maurice, to your point, like housing is one of them, healthcare is one of them. There's like all these other pieces, which I think is the big connection. I've been thinking, as you were both talking, of kind of concentric circles. Like there's what's at the center of the circle, the person's behavior pattern, in some ways has to do with like their own psychology, biology, historical context, physical, social context. But I think part of the theme I'm hearing in this conversation, what I personally believe, is that like all of the concentric circles around that lead to the pressure of that individual person might be experiencing. Yeah, like Jessica's point, that we're all using harm reduction all the time around reducing risk. So just maybe one last piece, which is like on this question of like how to treat people. Like that is a very big existential question. I don't know the answer. I think a lot about like this concept of the social contract. Well, what is society's job? What's the government's job? Like, what is our obligation as a society to each other? And that's where I get stuck. Like right now, my theme and my approach has been increasing support and education for people to have the sovereignty to make their own decisions.
Mhm.
And when you're in an environment where you have like such an adulterated drug supply, such an extreme edge where it's like so easy, like I think the edge just approaches so much faster than people, I think, expect. Even with all of the stigma, even with
Right.
all of the war on drugs, freaky, like don't be, blah, 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 even with all of that, people are still so surprised. And I think people are still caught by surprise. And that's where I'm like, okay, maybe it's like the billboard saying, like talking about harm reduction isn't enough. Maybe there's like some other thing. And I don't know what the answer is besides this like macro social change that gets people access to the resources and services they need. So sometimes I do get a little bit binary in my thinking, ironically, where I'm just like, is it all or nothing? Is it like either we just keep pulling people off the edge like over and over and over 800 times a year, 8,000 times a year, wherever it is? Or we have like the utopian world of our dreams? I don't know. For now, risk reduction works because I'm like, okay, let's at least get specific about what the actual issue is here. And then like slowly eke out from there. Yeah.
Yeah, there's appreciation for that um, reframe in the chat as well. We have 5 minutes left of our time together. I don't know. It always comes so quickly. I want to give everyone, and I know, right? No, an opportunity. Like, what hasn't been said yet? There's like 6 more questions that we haven't gotten to. I think some element of the question has been addressed a bit in what has been shared, but maybe each of you can think, knowing that we have 5 minutes left, what hasn't been said, and we'd love to hear from each of you.
There's so many good questions. I think I'll build off of a point, Ismail, that you were making about the question underneath the question. And I think one thing I am taking away, even from our own discussion today, is to continue to think about some prominent contradictions that exist in our relationship to risk and harm at a societal level, and think about part of our work as systemically and collectively actually trying to reconcile those contradictions. And to be more specific, I'm thinking about how, like legally speaking, United States is one of the few countries in the world that honors what we call like that has negative rights, right? We mostly say what you can't do rather than what you should have or be entitled to, at the same time being a like hyper liberty focused dominant culture. At least I think about the ways in which on one hand we have movements for fetal personhood, but so many other people are very disposable, right?
Yeah.
And I also think about how so many of our systems policies put people at much higher risk, right, just to exist, while giving folks often these overlapping and similar communities so little control, right? And that's sovereignty is a word that was brought up before. So I encourage us to think about those contradictions and how we're reconciling them to be more just, um, rather than think about risk reduction as it's like this thing that we are trying to see whether it's more or less effective. So I'll end there.
Anyone else? We have 3
Uh,
minutes. Yeah.
yeah, I just want to just add on and for us to keep thinking about this idea that if we're, harm reduction, risk reduction, these are just terms. This is just language. And as someone said in the chat, I forget, I apologize for forgetting the name, is part of what we do every day. You know, if you put on shoes, if you put a seatbelt on, whatever. And we've wrapped it in this language, and now it's like a political, it could be a political football, you know, kind of thing. And part of the reason I love harm reduction is one, I think Ishmael said this earlier, is that you can be like super creative, and also you can center it in love.
Mhm.
And that's not something as a therapist I've been taught to do until I really wrap my arms around harm reduction, to be able to be like, oh, I can love someone, right? And that can be something that helps and
Mhm.
promotes health. Sorry, Izzy, go ahead.
No, you're good. You're good. I'm really excited. I feel like every sentence that everyone has said today could be its own like whole huge depth level. But just maybe just as a couple closing things. One, I really appreciate the theme of love. Simple, straightforward. Why do we want to keep people alive? Why do we want to keep this going forward? I mean, it's love in life. And maybe just speaking to your last question that you put in the chat, Oriana, that I think also threads into a lot of the other pieces here, which is I do think that the only way, let me put this another way, one of the ways harm reduction, risk reduction, and healing justice shows up for me is in a willingness to sit with the contradictions and to, as I like to say, see past the paradox. There are many lenses that can be applied, and I feel like so much of my own life and growth in this work has been understanding that like looking through these different perspectives gives us a better understanding, never a complete understanding, and just like both holding always on that growth path and always the humility of not knowing. To me, like that's the center of it. And how to apply that in different situations, that's a fact-based case-by-case sort of situation, but at the very least having that thread feels really important. So yeah, just I know we're at time, just want to appreciate and would gladly continue this conversation with y'all if you and the audience and other folks are interested in that in the future. So thank you.
Yes, this is a part one. Absolutely. There is so much deep appreciation in the chat for all that you brought to this hour and a half. I invite folks to continue to offer your appreciation, offer the energy, the words, the perspective that you are leaving this space with in the chat. It is 11:31. So what do I want to say? If you are still here, there is going to be an evaluation that populates when you leave. So please do complete the evaluation. Let us know. We will return, hopefully. We will make space to return and to continue the conversation. I'm not going to share my slides again. You will receive the deck. Please, so deeply grateful for what you brought to this space. I am leaving with love and a reminder that Western medicine and often the ways we're trained to do our work removes our humanity and our love from the equation, and what we need so deeply is to be witnessed and held and loved. And so thank you so much. I hope you have a beautiful day and that we continue this conversation soon. And if you can, move slowly to your next thing. Wash your hands with some intention, drink some water, take a breath. Thank you.
Thank you all.
So much. Take care, everyone.
Peace.